Hi and welcome back to the Gemhogs YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share with you my variation of a Fob Inspired Spinner Pendant. So the bead is free to move, and I've added some little highlights with some additional small faceted beads around the edge. You don't have to have those if you don't want to, you can just go for a slightly more simplistic basic look, but I really enjoy this look and the feel of being able to spin the bead. So let's head down to the board and take a closer look. So today I've worked with some 4mm, just slightly off round faceted half coated glass beads and a feature bead or focal bead in Tiger's Eye, and this is around about 23mm across, just smaller than an inch. In terms of wire, my main section of wire is made with 1.25mm or 16 gauge. The bar that goes through the bead will need to be the thickest wire you can get through the drill aperture. In my case it was 1mm 18 gauge, and then I'm going to add in some 0.4mm or 26 gauge to add those beads in to highlight the design. So let's pop this piece up in the top corner and bring in that first section of wire. So the first thing we're going to do is to create the basic form, and once we've created the basic form you can decide whether or not you want to add those beads into position. The key for this design, as with many of my designs, is making sure that that wire is toasty warm. I'm going to hold onto one end of the wire and ensure that the central section is really soft and toasty. The wire I have in my hand now is a medium temper, which is ideal for the project. So that's as good and as warm as it's going to get today. I'm going to grab my basic wooden ring mandrel, and around the centre of that wire I'm going to create a circular form a little bit larger than the bead itself. So the way to kind of do that successfully is just to go for your life, see how it looks, and then try that bead in the aperture. See if you've got that right. So that looks a little bit small, to be perfectly honest, so we'll have a look. Yep, I have made that a little bit small. So the way to do that is to just put a little bit more warmth back into that wire, especially around those outer edges. Once you've toastified that up slightly, we'll bring the round form of your choice back into position and give that another little shape and form. Well, let's have another look. We want the bead to be able to sit inside that arc neatly, and if your ring mandrel doesn't quite go up to the size, then just grab something that's a good approximation of just a little bit larger. Medicine pot, lotion lid, something like that. So that looks reasonable to me at this stage. So if you think that you need that slightly larger, you can just open that out. Now the next tool I'm going to grab is actually a tool that is used for memory wire. Forming the loops on the end of memory wire takes a little bit of strength, and this makes it really easy. But I'm going to use this to create two repeatable coils in that wire. We're looking to create those coils in the wire at a point where the drill hole might sit. So if you put the bead into position and try and get the bead hole or bead aperture straight across that line, where that bead hole sits on the wire is where we're going to need to make a little double circle form. Now instead of creating that where we would normally create it, which is out to the side, we're going to create it in an opposite direction. So let's just put that first move into position. I think that's a little bit too far up, but let's just pop that in. We're looking to have the bead hole. Let's just get that into view. We want that to sit inside the tip top of that loop. Actually, that's bang on. That's exactly where I need it to be. So we don't want the bead to be pushed right down against the wire, because quite often that drill aperture, certainly in non-manufactured beads, in natural gemstone beads, the drill aperture isn't always perfectly central, the bead isn't always perfectly round. So what you might find if you make it perfect on one side is that when you flip the bead over, it will snag on that wire. So give yourself a little bit of room just up at above that, so that you've got some breathing space. What we're going to do then is pop that. You can use your round nose pliers if you don't have one of these, but pop the pin back in. The reason I like using one of these is because it gives me repeatable sizes. So what we want to do is to bring that wire all the way around. Not just once, let's just move that pin out of the way. So you can see we're creating a loop on the end of the wire there. So I'm going to need to put that back in again, and if I put it in the other way up now, What we're looking to do is to keep that as straight as possible going through the centre. Push the wire all the way back up and over. So you've got a double loop-de-loop on one end, and the wire returns back from whence it came. I'm just going to give that a bit of a warm through now so that it's nice and straight and ready to use. We then need to do the same thing on the other side, and you'll notice that it's forming a little bit of a spring type effect, and it's coming away from where the bead will sit. So if I flip that over in the other direction, what we're going to need to do is make sure that we get the wires looping around in the same direction. So if this was the front, the wire's gone over the top and underneath. So we need to create the exact same thing on the other side. It's going to be tricky with the camera because obviously it's going to snare on things. So let's just put that bead hole lined up to the little spring we've made. Make sure everything's still true. If it's come out of true, you can just slightly modify where it sits. In fact, what I might do is just flip this over in this orientation so that the wire comes up towards the camera. So let's make sure that the bead does still fit inside that aperture. This is kind of key to getting the design to work. So there's the drill hole, line it up to the little loop-de-loop. We need to then make sure that we're putting our bend just about here. So you can pop those pliers back in, draw the wire up and over so it's moving again in the same orientation. What we want to do at this stage before we continue spinning around that pin is to pop the bead in again, and it's very boring to keep putting that into position and then removing it because that looks like there's a little bit too much of a gap down underneath. Let's flip the bead over. Again, a little bit too much of a bead. Now I can fix that at this stage by rotating the pliers around slightly and drawing that wire back underneath. Let's give that one more try. That's sitting a little bit better. So what I've done is I've used some of the wire from the horseshoe shape or the U shape. I've used a little bit of that to turn over. Now that might mean that that loop is a little bit small, so let's have a look. That does actually fit really nicely. So I'm going to bring the wire back over the top and then draw that back down. So both sides are symmetrical. You've got those springs coming away from that horseshoe shape in the centre. Let's try sitting the bead into position through the drill hole. And if it's still not quite right, you can modify that slightly. Let's pop the pin back into position. I'll show you how. What we're going to do is grip very firmly. Draw this tail of wire up. We want to reduce this distance in the horseshoe. So I'm going to pull that over the top. Pull over the top. You do need quite a little firm grip there. And then we're going to try that bead back in position, and you can see we've shrunk down the size of the horseshoe. Now what can happen when you're playing around with this section is that it ever so slightly comes out of true, so do take your time to just get that to sit nice and neat. Close up those little loop-de-loops so that they are indeed tight like a spring, and then we'll move on to the next stage in just a second. So this section of the tutorial is really the one that I would spend most time on, making sure that you're happy with that form, that it fits the bead, that the bead will spin. You can even pop your bead onto your finer gauge wire and just sit it in the centre and make sure that it will spin correctly once it's set. Just take your time at this stage, because if it's not quite right here, it won't ever be quite right, and it'll just take a little bit of time to get that straight and true, and then we'll move on. So once you're happy that everything fits right and that you've got a good U shape or a good horseshoe shape just here, that the coils are nice and neat and tidy and even and tightly closed up, that your bead will indeed spin in position, we can move on now. So what I tend to do is just give these tails of wire a little bit of heat and warmth, just to make sure that they're ready for the next stage. We're working with a medium temper 1.25mm or 16 gauge, so it's a little bit more feisty than your 1mm gauge, but working in this slightly heavier wire, slightly firmer wire, will definitely improve the finished product. So once you are ready to move on, we're going to find a round form that fits really neatly to the size of the bead, or the bead aperture rather, and what we're going to do is we're going to tilt this slightly on the round form. What we're looking for is to have the second set of wires, these two upright ones, be just slightly higher and larger than the U shape that we're working with. So what you can achieve this by tilting the wire U shape on the mandrel, drawing the wires over to meet in the centre. Now wire will always bounce up a little bit, and that's fine. We actually want it to be slightly larger, so allowing that to bounce up slightly is not a bad thing at all, because it gives us the capacity to then add some beads into the mix if we want to. If you don't want to put the beads in the position just above the spinning fob. Now initially this was a design that was used to carry a seal, and quite frequently instead of having a two-faced flat coin bead such as the one I'm working with, it might even have been a three-faced bead. It often had things like carnelian or onyx, beautiful traditional gemstones, and also frequently had the family crest or seal, so it could be used to seal important wax letter seals. So that's one of the things that they were originally used for. I don't know why I'm telling you that, it just popped into my head. Quite often they were really fancy. Now this is very much a modern interpretation. I've used my Loki Bail up at the top because I think it gives it quite an element of modernity against this traditional spinning fob design. So you don't have to put the gems in if you don't want to. You can just bring these wires at the back down a little bit and then create the upright bend, as we're about to do now, to create your bail of choice. I'm going to show you how to achieve the Loki Bail today anyway, because I talk about it often enough. So making sure that you're happy with those wire bends, that they're symmetrical, that they sit just slightly above the initial horseshoe that you've created, making sure you're happy with the straightness. I'm not happy with the straightness there, so I'm just going to give that a little bit of a tilt. That's better. And then we're going to come just to the one side of the upright. So you've got the two wires crossing over at the back there. I'm going to grip hold just to the right of centre on the rightmost wire, push that wire up in the air. So that's coming up just to the right of the 12 o'clock. I think I might need to take that over ever so slightly more actually. So if you do, you can very simply squish that over a tiny little bit. And then I'm going to do the same thing but on the other side, so slightly to the left of the centre. Now because I'm right dominant, it's so much more efficient for me to turn the piece over and pop the bend in by hand in the upside down. So what we're looking for is to have those two wires as symmetrically positioned with that upright bend as possible. And I've left a gap because I want to set some beads into this design later. So another thing we're going to do is just make sure that we haven't taken anything out of whack, anything has gone wrong. Now is the time to fix it. Once you start fitting those beads, it becomes next to impossible to moderate any of your coils or any of the positions of the bend, the U-shape, so on and so forth. So what I tend to do is grab that round form, just make sure that I'm happy. You could indeed give that a little tap with a small toffee hammer or something similar if you wanted to, and just make sure that those two uprights sit centrally. So I'm going to grab some finer wire now, and what I tend to do is cut around about 15 inches, 12 to 15 inches anyway, of my 0.4mm gauge. I'm just going to snip that away and get that ready. And what we're going to do is apply that between the front U-shape that sits just here above the fob bead, and we're going to rotate, I think probably from the backmost wire. So what I'm going to do here is allow a couple of inches of spare wire, and I'll show you for why. Just hold that into position. I'm going to rotate it around the rear higher wire 3 times. So that's 1. That's a second rotation and then a third rotation. Then I'm going to take that across the back of the design, around underneath to the lower U-shaped wire. And I'm going to then rotate 3 times around this one. That's 1. That's a second rotation. Sorry camera. And then we go for a third rotation. What we're going to do now is add in one of our beads of choice. So I've taken that 2 inches on the end. It just means it's easier for me to loop onto the wire and get the weave going before I grab my first bead in. Now the beads I'm choosing to work with are 2-tone. I think they're fire polished, but I've lost the packet years ago, so I've no idea really. They're around about 3 to 4 millimeters. They're somewhere between a round and a rondelle. I don't know what the name for that is. I think it's just a chubby rondelle. and I'm going to set one of those into the channel created like so. So you can just open that out slightly if there's just not enough space, but there is pretty much enough space there. And then we're going to take the tail of the wire, the short little bit here, and we're going to rotate 3 times around the rearmost of those 2 little channel wires. Now what I like to do on the end of the design here, let's just get that 3rd rotation done before I carry on. Pull that through with your pliers, all the way across the back, and then I'll finish off by rotating 3 times around. And this is a traditional beaded channel setting. So if I show you underneath, you have a bar of just wire on the rear of the design, and on the front of the design you sit a bead. So you can scooch this up and down to make your life slightly easier. What we're going to do now is just go for 3 rotations around the end. And that's all the way around 1. 2nd time. There we go. I've just changed my glasses and I can't actually see. Bring that all the way through and around, and then that 3rd rotation, we're always looking for sort of 3 rotations to give us a nice sturdy connection to the design. Get that sitting as neat as possible down, flush to the wire, tidy that little coil up, and then push it all the way down towards that little spring section that we've made down here. So if I hold this in the centre of the focal length of the camera, you can see that we've got a naked pass of wire across the back. Oh, that little bit's just kicked up. Let's make sure that's nice and tidy before we go any further. It's really easy to lose sight of these things, so always do a little bit of a rub test and make sure you're not getting spiked by any sticky uppy bits of wire. That's now nice and tidy and tight. I'm going to push that all the way down to the spring on the end, and I'll show you how to sit 1 more bead, and then we'll move on to the next section of the tutorial. So let's grab a bead. We're moving now in the opposite direction. The key to remembering this weave, it's a very simple weave, it's a channel setting weave for drilled beads between 2 firm pieces of wire, is you sit the bead on the upper side of the design, so where it's visible, here, and then underneath, if I flip this over and move the spinning fob out of the way, you can see the bead is elevated to the front, and on the rear of the design you have those passes of just wire. So let's rotate, and in this direction it's easy. You get to bring the wire up the centre all the way around until you've got those 3 wraps, and then across the back, no bead, making sure that you don't pull these 2 sections of wire too close together or it'll be troublesome to fit the next bead into position. So if I pop this down for a moment, I'll talk you through finishing that whilst I take it off screen and continue getting it ready for the next stage. So I managed to fit 5 beads along the one side. Using exactly the same process and pattern, I set a bead in the centre, and then I continued beading down the other side. Now you don't have the access point up the centre here, which is the easy side, but it does mean that you are working with as few lengths of that fine wire as possible. And then 5 beads down the other side. Doesn't matter how many beads you set, as long as you try to keep them symmetrical. So I've got 11 beads on that rainbow or horseshoe shape, with a central bead just to make it sit and look symmetrical. So I'm going to continue doing this, and I'll join you back in just a moment. I just thought I'd show you how to sit that central bead. So I've got my 5 beads coming up the left hand side, and you can see how that's all coming together. So I'm going to ensure that these are scooched up towards the centre so they sit neatly and evenly spaced. I've got the wire rotating 3 times around the upper or rearward side. So I'm going to grab one of those beads now and sit the wire slightly more diagonally, like so that the bead sits in the middle of the 2 side wires that will form the bail in just a moment. And I'm going to use that access point to wrap 3 times, supporting those wrap points so that it sits centrally to those left and right uprights. And then I'm going to bring the wire over to the right hand side of that point, push the wire down between those 2 channel wires. That's 1 wrap, making sure that I'm not pulling these too tight together. If I do pull it too tight together, it means I won't be able to set the bead. If that happens, because you've not loaded anything, you can very gently pull and the wire will unspool from this side slightly. Let's grab another one of those beads. Allow that to sit down into position, and then you have the slightly less fun task of feeding that wire through rather than being able to draw it through easily. It's exactly the same technique, just a tad more fiddly. So get those 3 wires wrapped neatly, tighten up those 3 little wraps, and then draw the wire across the back and that naked pass of wire. Wrap 3 times and continue with your next 4 beads until you've completed filling this channel. So I've set beads on both sides, and I've ensured that those little loop-de-loop sections are good and strong and straight, and I'll show you how to create a beaded Loki bail now before we move on to setting that spinning fob. To secure a nice, strong, elongated drop bail like this, I'm going to give a slightly different weave than I normally use today. I am going to be using a very normal wire though. I do like to use 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire quite a lot in designs like this, and we're going to make this piece super strong. We're going to add a plain pass of wire between each of the times that we set a bead, as well as one across the back. So I've just passed the end of my 12 inches or so of that finer gauge wire just underneath the design. I'm going to start off by rotating 3 sides around one of those upright bail bars. That's 1, that's 2. Quite often using your pliers to help you get good grip is a little bit more useful, and we just waste the teeny tiny bit of wire. If you're feeling very thrifty or working in precious metal, you can obviously do that a slightly different way. So I'm going to cozy up those coils so that they're nice and neat and tidy. Get those wires to sit side by side and then scooch them all the way down so that it nestles just behind the design. What I'm going to do is to imagine that there's a bead in position already in the channel, draw that wire across the back, and then I'm going to wind 3 times around the right upright, draw the wire all the way across the front, 3 times around the left upright. So we've got a naked pass of wire across the back, a naked pass of wire across the front, and another naked pass of wire across the back. Now we're going to add our first bead, and it's just a slightly different variation to when I normally put beads into bails. So let's grab our first bead, slide that all the way down the wire into position, and nestle it between the wires so it sits on top of the design. It's proud of those wires. Draw that 3 times around the left hand side upright, all the way across the back without anything on the wire. Don't get those 2 tram lines too close together. Naked pass of wire across the rear side, and then 3 times around the right, across the front once without a bead, 3 times around the left, all the way across the back, 3 times around the right. And I'm running through this relatively quickly. You can take a lot more time and make it much neater, but I want to be able to show you all of the design and move on to making the Loki inspired bail. Drop your bead down into position. Now you don't have to have 3. I quite like using the element of 3 in jewellery making. I don't quite know where it comes from, but there we go. Let's rotate 3 times around that left hand upright, all the way around. Push that down. Now you can, as I say, take a little bit more time than I am to make each of those little clusters of 3 wraps as neat and tidy. All the way across the back without a bead, 3 times around the right wire, all the way across the front without a bead, 3 times around the left wire. Scooch those neatly into a lovely coil position. Draw the wire so that they don't sit too close together, 3 times around the right hand, and then we're going to add our final bead. So let's grab the last one for today in, slide that down the zip line into position, hold that neatly so it sits between but proud of the top of the wires. We're going to wrap 3 times around the left hand upright. It's uppermost on your screen at the moment. Draw that down into position. Each time you make a little coil of 3, you can sniggle them up together. That's not even a word. 3 times around the right hand wire, once across the front, 3 times around the left hand wire, and we're going to finish with another naked pass of wire across the rear side, 3 times around the right, and then we're going to trim away. So it doesn't take terribly long at all to develop that elongated drop bail. Going to give that a little bit of an extra tiny amount just on the end here. Let's put that in the scrap pot for later. get those tools out of the way, and then we're just going to push that wire all the way down and around. Give that a little bit of a tighten up, making sure that everything is as neat as possible. Again, it's definitely worth trying your bead in. I've got thousands of beads, so if it doesn't quite fit, I'll simply use another one, but you might have one particular one in mind. We're now going to grab some straight pliers. What we want to do here is to draw both of those upright wires forwards, not quite to not quite to 90 degrees, but very much past that 45. So there we go. 45 would be about here, and 90 would be straight. So almost, but not quite. Now I tend to use my bail making pliers for this next manoeuvre. It's sometimes much easier to use a pencil because you can just wrap both of those wires around just the once or twice if you prefer. I think I've got quite short wire here today, so I might just go for one time around so that we can add those coils. So I'm going to use step number 5 on my bail making pliers, and I'm going to pop that in just to position, making sure that it's straight and not on the wonk. And I think rather than rotating the pliers, I'm going to push the wire over and around. So if I pull that out of position, you can see that it's slightly forwards, which means that it sits more comfortably on the body. It doesn't push into the body, because we want this to sit quite flat against the body, not to be pushed forwards by a great big bulbous bail. Now, as I say, sometimes having a pencil actually makes this a little easier. So I'm just going to do one side at a time now, to draw the wire around and across over the front, like so. And then I'll switch to the other side. I've slightly misshapen that, so I just need to rotate a little bit as I bring that wire through. That's better. And draw that through. Now you can go for another rotation when making the Loki bail if you like, but I've only got a limited amount of wire left available to me. So I'm just going to make sure that they sit as neatly as possible, and then I'm going to trim them to the same length. Now the Loki bail came into being a long time ago, when I wasn't sure that I wanted to spend hours and hours winding lots and lots of wire to create a woven bail. So I came up with this design because it makes really, really quickly. So let's just trim both of those tails to the same length. The only reason I put my hand quite so close to the danger zone is to stop it from flinging the little bit of residue off into infinity. What I'm going to do now is, again, using a pencil is quite handy because you can pop the bail onto your round form as you create the little spirals that come away. What we're going to do is to spiral them away in opposite direction. So I'm just going to start that whilst it's on the mandrel, or on the, in this case, on my pliers. Draw that all the way around. The reason it's easier to do it actually on the round form is because it means you don't accidentally misshape the bail itself. If that's not a possibility, and it is worthwhile just having a pencil in your workshop, then you are able to do that freehand and just straighten everything up afterwards. So that's the Loki bail for you, and today we've woven a little bit of a drop neck on that bail as well. So you've got options for making the bail itself. Obviously I had a little bit more wire available to me on that one, but that's the essence of the Loki bail, and using a pencil will enable you to just straighten those two sides up. Well, I hope that you're enjoying learning how to make the Loki beaded bail with me. For the last part of today's video tutorial, we're going to set the spinning part of the modern Fob Inspired Spinner Pendant. To sit the spinning bead in your Fob Inspired Pendant, we are going to use the heaviest wire you can safely get through your bead. Now, sometimes using an artificial man-made bead gives you the ability to have a much larger drill hole. Sometimes you get lucky. So I've got 1mm or 18 gauge wire here, and it sits really nicely and easily through my beautiful tiger's eye puffy bead. My tiger's eye bead is around about 23mm. So just smaller than an inch across. So what we're going to do is to, on one end, create a spiral, a little double spiral, and if you start quite close to the end of your round nose pliers, you usually take around about an inch to make a double spiral. So let's start by rotating that around in a circular formation. Switch to your flat facing pliers and continue to push that spiral into your non-dominant fingertip. If you're left-handed or left dominant, just invert what we're doing. So we've got 2 passes of wire. We've got 1 and then 2, and then the wire comes away. At the point that the wire comes away from the spiral, we want to change this from a nice smooth section of wire coming away to a very firm right angle. So if I grip the wire firmly as it leaves that spiral and then pull the spiral away, you end up with this lollipop looking type deal, and that's what we're looking to do. So if we pop that through the first set of little spiral coils that we made at the beginning of the tutorial, push that all the way through and then allow the bead to sit into position, and then you can retract that all the way down until it can go through the other side. So I'm just taking that into position first and then pushing that wire up through the double spiral we created. Now it's kind of useful to get a feel for how much wire it takes to make a double spiral like this, because we're going to be cutting this wire in just a moment. Now if you take a look at the spiral, the wire is coming down and moving around in this direction. To me, it makes sense to have it do the same on the other side. So the first thing I'm going to do is to make sure that that will spin freely inside the bead, because it means when the bead is sitting and the second spiral's been added, it means that the bead will spin freely. So I'm now going to grab my ancient metal rule and measure around about 1 inch before I trim away the end with my flush cutters. So 1 inch from the point at which we made that right angle bend. I'm just controlling that wire from disappearing forever. Get that scruffy old ruler out the way. And then we're going to grab those round nose pliers again and try our hardest to make a spiral as similar to the first spiral as we possibly can. So let's grab the wire quite close to the end of the pliers. Start rotating that around, and just once you get that going, switch to any of your flat facing pliers. I'm using my bent chain nose pliers. I've had them forever. They used to be a little bit more vibrant than this, but purple sparkle pliers is harder to say than you might imagine, are definitely one of my trademarks. So there's your second little spiral on the end there, and now we have a hearty brace of Fob Inspired Spinning Pendants. I hope that you've enjoyed making the Fob Inspired Spinner Pendant with me. I love these little guys, it's so much fun to play with. There's a lot of mileage to be had with the Loki Bail as well. So you've got a double bubble masterclass today, the Fob Inspired Spinning Pendant and the Beaded Loki Bail. Have yourself an absolutely wonderful day, and I do hope to see you back here again on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very, very soon. Bye for now.